No one touches my daughter when I'm not home. Especially not you." The words sliced through the steam-filled bathroom, sharp and cold like a window left open in winter. Ruth Albright froze, her hand still hovering above the washcloth she'd just placed on Lily's tiny chest. The child blinked up at her, calm and drowsy from the warm bath, unaware that the moment her father burst through the door, the entire air in the house shifted. The last time someone had yelled at Ruth like that, it was a hospital orderly trying to tear her nephew from her arms during a custody dispute. But this was different. This time, the voice came from a man who had once trusted her with everything the man whose daughter now reached for Ruth more easily than she did for him. Earlier that morning, Ruth remembered Lily asking in her soft lisp, "Are you going to be here when I wake up from my nap?" She had smiled and promised yes. Now that promise shattered like porcelain on the tiles. Charles Whitaker stood in the doorway, fury wrapped in a tailored gray suit. His tie was askew, his eyes wild. Ruth instinctively wrapped the towel tighter around Lily, who whimpered in confusion. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked. "She's naked. How dare you touch her like this?" Ruth's lips parted, but no sound came. She wanted to speak, to explain that Lily had a low-grade fever, that the child had been sweating in her sleep, waking up confused, crying, that no one else was around, that Ruth had done what she always did, what Maria had asked her to do long ago. Care for Lily like her own. But Charles wasn't listening. He was already pulling Lily into his arms, muttering curses under his breath. Lily clung to Ruth's sleeve, crying now, fingers grasping desperately. "I want you out," Charles said. His voice was trembling. "Now." Ruth stood up slowly, her knees cracked slightly from kneeling so long. She moved carefully, deliberately, not to alarm the child, saying, her dress clung damply to her calves from the bathwater on the tiles. "She had a fever," Ruth finally said, her voice calm, steady. "She needed comfort. That's all it was." Charles didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the bathroom with Lily, who was sobbing against his chest. The child's tiny hand stretched backward toward Ruth until it disappeared around the corner. Downstairs, the house had the hush of accusation. The marble floors echoed with each of Ruth's footsteps. She walked into the foyer where Walter Gaines, the longtime house manager, stood uncertainly near the front door, holding Ruth's coat. "She okay?" Ruth asked quietly. Walter hesitated. "Charles is upset, but he'll cool off." "I wasn't asking about him," she said. Walter gave a slight nod. "Lily's crying for you, but he won't let me bring you back upstairs." Ruth slipped on her coat. It was still warm from the radiator in the kitchen. Her heart was strangely calm. Not numb, but not angry either. Just tired. Tired in the way people get when they've been wrongly accused and realize no explanation will be enough. At the door, she turned to Walter. "Watch her tonight. If she coughs or cries more than twice, you call me. Don't wait for his permission." Walter nodded. He opened the door for her but didn't say goodbye. Just stood there, a statue of regret. Outside, the air was crisp. Spring in Blue Haven brought blossoms and chill winds in equal measure. Ruth pulled her coat tighter. She could still smell the faint lavender of Lily's bathwater on her sleeve. Back inside, Charles paced the nursery. Lily lay curled in the corner of the bed, her cheeks flushed from fever and tears. He poured himself a scotch from the bar cart, 2 fingers, just like he always did when stress wrapped around his throat. But tonight, he didn't drink it, just stared at the amber liquid as if it held an answer he'd never bothered to ask before. Upstairs, Walter adjusted the thermostat. As he passed the portrait of Maria Whitaker in the hall, he paused. Her painted smile looked softer in the low light. He remembered her last words to him. "If anything happens to me, make sure Ruth stays. She knows Lily better than anyone." But the house didn't speak. It never did. It just absorbed. That night, silence wrapped around the estate like ivy. Even the wind outside refused to howl. Charles stood in the nursery doorway long after Lily fell asleep. Her breathing was uneven, and her small hands twitched occasionally. She murmured something he couldn't hear. Then, clear as a bell, she whispered, "Mama." He thought she meant Maria, but then she said it again this time, softer, more certain. "Mama Ruth." Charles sat down in the armchair beside the crib. He didn't move, didn't speak. The child slept. That night, as Charles sits in the nursery watching Lily whimper in her sleep, she murmurs one word. "Mama." Earlier that day, Ruth had stood on the sidewalk outside the estate gates, staring at the long gravel drive as if it were the threshold to a house that no longer remembered her. Now, just 30 hours later, she was back not as staff, not even as friend, but as a mother in disguise. The call had come just before sunrise. Walter's voice was strained, low, almost whispering. "It's Lily," he'd said. "Her fever's back. And Charles, he's asking for you." She had not expected that. Not after the way he'd dismissed her, the way his voice had cut through her like broken glass. But then again, Ruth had long since learned that desperation was its own kind of confession. When she entered the nursery, the scent of illness clung to the air, Vicks, old sweat, and lavender. Lily lay motionless under a thin cotton blanket, her skin pale and slick with fever. Her breathing was shallow, fluttery like the wings of a bird caught in a net. Charles stood in the corner, still in yesterday's clothes, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands uselessly balled at his sides. The scotch from the night before sat untouched on the windowsill. His eyes were red, not from drink, but from helplessness. Ruth moved without speaking. She wet a cloth in cool water, wiped Lily's forehead, then adjusted her pillows just slightly to elevate her chest. Her touch was practiced, tender, neither hurried nor hesitant. Charles watched every move. "She kept calling for you," he said finally, voice cracking. "I figured," Ruth replied softly, wringing out the cloth. "She knows who comforts her." He nodded, silent. Guilt was a heavy thing. It slumped his shoulders, pulled at his jaw. He had always been a man of action, deals, decisions, power. But in this room, he was just a father, and a lost one at that. "She was fine yesterday morning," he said suddenly, like a boy trying to explain a broken vase. "Then, I don't know. She kept asking where you were. Wouldn't eat. Wouldn't sleep. And then the fever came back." Ruth tucked the blanket around Lily's small legs. "Children know when they've been abandoned," she said quietly, "even if no one says the words out loud." Charles winced. For the rest of the morning, she sat beside Lily, whispering little things, a story about ducks, a song she remembered from her grandmother's house in Georgia. The child didn't fully wake, but her fever eased, her lips stopped trembling. By late afternoon, Charles finally spoke again. "Why didn't you fight me?" he asked. "Why didn't you yell back, tell me I was wrong?" Ruth didn't look at him. "Because I was tired of being accused. And because I knew you'd call me when you realized what really mattered. A long silence. Then, you're right. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was a beginning. Later, as evening settled, Charles invited her downstairs to talk. They sat in the conservatory, sunlight filtering through the glass ceiling like golden silk. It was quiet here, removed from the nursery's feverish shadows. I want to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer honestly. Ruth crossed her legs, hands folded in her lap. Why did you stay all these years? She thought for a long moment. Then she said, Because Maria asked me to. She knew she was dying long before you did. She wanted someone here who wouldn't be afraid to love Lily completely. Charles leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She told me once, he said, that love isn't inherited, it's chosen. I didn't understand that until this week. They sat like that for a while, the quiet between them finally a place to rest instead of a battlefield. But peace didn't last long. 2 days later, while Ruth was folding Lily's clothes in the laundry room, she noticed a strange glint through the basement window. A man, dark ball cap, heavy jacket, watching the house from the street beyond the hedges. When she stepped closer, he disappeared. She told Walter. He checked the cameras. Nothing showed. But she knew what she saw. And she knew who it might be. That night, Ruth sat alone in the back bedroom, once reserved for visiting relatives. It was the smallest room in the estate, but it faced the garden and caught the moonlight. She opened the drawer of the bedside table and took out a photo. A younger Ruth, holding a swaddled infant, smiling uncertainly. Beside her stood a man, his arms slung casually around her waist, his eyes dark and unreadable. Mason Dillard. She hadn't said his name aloud in years. Downstairs, Charles poured himself a drink, then poured it out again. He wandered the empty halls until he stopped in front of Maria's portrait. The brushstrokes seemed sharper tonight, the eyes more knowing. He whispered into the silence. Did you know what Ruth carried with her? Did you know what she was running from? But the painting said nothing, as always. Later, Charles peeked in on Lily. She was sleeping soundly, holding a stuffed bunny Ruth had sewn for her. He exhaled. Then he looked down at the baby monitor's camera screen and froze. There, for a single flickering second, was static. Then a face. Not Ruth's, not his. Then it was gone. Ruth, meanwhile, sat rigidly in her room, the old photograph clutched tightly in her hand, heart thudding. Because tonight, she had felt something shift, not just in the house, in the air. And when she glanced once more out the window toward the street, the same man was back. She hadn't said his name aloud in years, but now she was certain Mason Dillard had found her again. Heard you're back in the house. That's got tongues wagging all over Blue Haven. Ruth paused at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, and turned slowly to see Eleanor Whitaker standing in the doorway with her signature sharp heels and even sharper smile. The woman hadn't changed. Perfectly pressed blazer, pearls around her neck like armor, and eyes that had judged Ruth the moment she first stepped foot inside the estate as a hired maid. Eleanor had never liked that Ruth had been Maria's choice, not just for housekeeper, but for confidant, and certainly not for anything more. The moment held weight. The echo of old slights and sharp glances hung between them. But Ruth, older now, steadier, simply dried her hands and offered a polite nod. I didn't realize people outside this house cared that much, she replied. Eleanor crossed into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, though she barely sipped it. When someone gets dismissed one day and is back by the next sunrise, it raises questions, especially when that someone is a maid and a black woman. The emphasis wasn't subtle. It was meant to sting. "I came back for Lily," Ruth said calmly. "Charles asked me." "Oh, I'm sure he did." Eleanor's smile thinned. "But let me give you some advice, woman to woman. This town doesn't forgive blurred lines. And right now, people are asking whether your relationship with Charles is entirely professional." Ruth's spine stiffened, but her expression didn't change. She had learned not to blink when someone wanted her small. "Children don't care about town gossip," she said. "They care about who shows up when they're sick." That silenced Eleanor for a beat, but she wasn't done. "I also heard that someone's been seen hanging around the property," she added, her voice lowered now. "A man? Shady looking. This house doesn't need that kind of attention, neither does Charles's reputation." Ruth's hands clenched the towel. "You saw someone?" "No. But when enough people talk, it becomes truth whether you like it or not." Eleanor left with a perfectly measured pivot, her heels clicking like punctuation on a warning. Ruth stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the counter as if it might give her answers. The air suddenly felt colder. Later that morning, Charles called Ruth into his study. The room was lined with dark oak shelves and the scent of old money leather and faint cigar smoke. He didn't look up from his laptop when she entered. "Eleanor called a board member," he said flatly. "Said she's concerned about optics, that it looks like I'm playing favorites, that it's not appropriate for you to be here without formal employment documentation." Ruth folded her arms. "You're the one who asked me back." "I know." He finally looked at her, and something vulnerable passed between them. "But you know how these people are. Image over substance." She took a breath. "So what do you want to do?" "I want to make it official. Full reinstatement, with protections." He paused. "And I want to publicly acknowledge your role, as Lily's caregiver, as family." Ruth blinked. "You'd say that out loud?" He gave a bitter smile. "I've said plenty of worse things." He moved to a side drawer and pulled out a folder. "There's something else. Maria left a sealed envelope in her will, addressed to you. I didn't open it." Ruth stared at it, suddenly unsure. She reached for it slowly, hands shaking slightly. The paper was thick, hand-addressed. Her name Ruth Albright in Maria's unmistakable cursive. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she tucked it into her apron and stepped out into the garden. The spring sun was warming the roses just beginning to bloom. She sat on a bench and finally slit the envelope open with her nail. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "Ruth, if you're reading this, then it means Charles has finally stopped being a fool. And you're back where you belong. I didn't have the strength to tell him everything before I died, but I trust you will, in your own time. What you've given Lily, what you gave me, quietly and without condition, is more than most people ever get in a lifetime. I never thanked you properly, but I saw you." With all my heart, Maria Ruth read the letter twice, then pressed it to her chest. She didn't cry, but the tightness in her throat was nearly unbearable. That evening, while Charles was on a call, Ruth received another message, this time from an unknown number. One line. "Still think you're safe in that big house? I know where the garden bench is." Her breath caught. The phone slid slightly in her damp palm. She scanned the windows. Nothing. No figure in the hedges. No shadow across the lawn. That night, she asked Walter to double-check all locks. She didn't tell him why. At dinner, Charles announced his plans to hold a press event, acknowledging Ruth publicly. He said it plainly in front of Walter and Lily, who was feeling better and giggling with a mouthful of mashed potatoes. Ruth didn't protest. She simply nodded. A part of her wanted the world to know. Another part knew Mason might take that as an invitation. Later, in her room, she reread Maria's letter. She stared at the line, "I trust you will, in your own time." The truth wasn't just about Charles anymore. It was about protection. About making sure Lily never felt the kind of fear Ruth had once lived through. The wind rustled the trees outside. The roses tapped gently against the glass like small, persistent fingers. In the shadows across the lawn, a camera lens glinted once before vanishing. The message had come from a burner number. And now, someone was watching her closer than ever. "Ruth, does this mean anything to you?" Charles's voice carried a strange unease, one Ruth hadn't heard in years, not even at Maria's funeral. He stood in the corner of the study holding a photograph in his hand, the edges charred as if someone had tried to burn it, but lost their nerve at the last second. Ruth crossed the room slowly, her apron still dusted with flour from baking with Lily that morning. When she took the photo, her fingers trembled. She didn't need to study it. She knew it by touch alone. It was taken 23 years ago in South Carolina, long before Blue Haven, before Maria, before Charles. She was just 20 at the time, wearing a sundress and no makeup. Her arms were wrapped around Mason, and her smile was unguarded. Real. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. Charles looked down at his desk. "Someone slipped it under the back door, no note." Her breath caught. "Someone?" He nodded. "The timing's not a coincidence." Ruth turned the photo over. On the back, in black ink, were the words, "She's not who she says she is." The edges of her world tilted slightly, as if the room itself resented her for keeping the past buried. She steadied herself against the corner of the desk. Charles watched her carefully. "I don't care what this means, but I think it's time you told me what you've been hiding." Ruth closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her chest like stones. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she turned and walked out of the study, photo still in hand. Outside, the sky was overcast, heavy with the threat of spring rain. Ruth walked the perimeter of the property, eyes scanning the woods beyond the hedges. She stopped near the back fence, where the leaves were freshly disturbed. She wasn't imagining things. Mason was here. He had found her, and now he wanted her life to unravel again, thread by careful thread. Inside the house, Eleanor was stirring trouble of her own. She'd invited two of Charles's oldest board members for tea without informing him. The Whitaker parlor, once a place for quiet piano melodies, and Maria's gentle laughter had turned into a cold war command center, with Eleanor serving sugar and venom in equal measure. "I only raised the question," she said sweetly, "because the media might not be as forgiving as Charles hopes, especially if personal attachments start looking like impropriety." The implication was clear. Ruth was becoming a liability. Walter overheard the conversation from the hall. Later, he found Ruth in the kitchen pantry, sitting on the step stool with her head in her hands. She had the photograph spread on her lap, and her silence was a language he knew well. "You need to say something," Walter said gently, "before someone else says it for you." She didn't answer, but he sat beside her anyway, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this." That night, while Ruth helped Lily into bed, the child asked, "Is someone mad at you?" Ruth froze. "Why do you ask, baby?" Lily clutched her bunny tighter. "Because the man in the bushes said something mean. He had a phone. He said you'd pay for leaving." The room spun. Ruth pulled the covers up to Lily's chin and kissed her forehead. "Did you tell anyone else?" Lily shook her head. "I thought I dreamed it." Ruth hugged her fiercely. "It wasn't your fault. I promise." Later, after Lily fell asleep, Ruth stood at the window, her gaze locked on the shadows just beyond the hedges. Then she picked up the phone and called the only person who might know how to deal with Mason Dillard. A woman's voice answered. "I hoped you'd never call this number again," she said. "Too bad," Ruth replied. "He's here. And he's starting again." Silence. Then, "Do you still have what he gave you? The real copy?" "Yes," Ruth said. "Locked away." "Then you're already in danger." The line went dead. She knew what had to be done. She walked back to the study where Charles sat working on his laptop. She placed the photo on his desk and said, "His name is Mason Dillard. He was part of my life before any of this, and he's not here for money." Charles looked up. "What's he here for?" She took a deep breath. "For Lily. Because he thinks she might be his." The room went utterly still. Charles stood, but not with rage, with disbelief. "She's mine," he said. "Maria and I, she was ours." Ruth looked at him, her voice soft but firm. "You should get a test. You deserve to know the truth." Charles stared at her for a long time, something breaking quietly behind his eyes. "Does she know?" he asked. "No, and she never will unless we let this man destroy everything." He nodded once, then reached for the photograph. His hand shook. Later that night, while the house lay in silence, a match was struck just outside the garden gate. Something small caught fire in the hedges, burning quietly a second copy of the photo, its edges curling inwards like petals. And across town, Mason Dillard circled a date on a calendar with red ink. Lily's 6th birthday. It was just 3 days away. "You can't outrun paternity. Not forever." The words weren't shouted. They arrived in a plain manila envelope with no return address, slipped beneath the kitchen door while Ruth was washing dishes. Charles read the letter aloud without looking up, each syllable tasting like betrayal. Ruth stood frozen, the suds clinging to her fingertips. She had expected Mason to escalate, but not like this. Not with threats wrapped in clean stationery and mailed from shadows. That morning had begun in quiet preparation. Lily's 6th birthday was 2 days away, and Charles had insisted on hosting a private garden party, no press, just close friends and a handful of family. But now, plans felt brittle under the weight of that envelope. Upstairs, Ruth pulled the original test results from a shoebox hidden behind the loose panel in the closet wall. The paper was yellowing, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still sharp enough to draw blood. Paternity excluded with 99.9% certainty. She had meant to burn it years ago, but something stopped her, maybe a need for insurance, maybe guilt. Walter found her in the hallway outside Lily's room, gripping the paper so tightly her knuckles whitened. He didn't ask questions, just glanced down and said, "You need to decide. Do you want the truth to protect her or to hurt him?" Ruth didn't answer. She couldn't yet. That evening, Charles called a family meeting in the parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth despite the warm spring air. Walter stood off to the side, arms folded. Eleanor, uninvited but omnipresent, perched on the corner chair like a crow waiting for a carcass to cool. "I've ordered a DNA test," Charles announced. "Lily's and mine. It will be here tomorrow. We'll do it quietly, at home. No labs, no gossip." Ruth nodded once. Eleanor scoffed. That's assuming you trust the result. You know these things can be manipulated. Charles's voice was cold. Only if someone's willing to lie. Eleanor's eyes flicked to Ruth. People lie all the time, especially when they think their lies protect a child. Ruth stood, slow and deliberate. The only lie that ever mattered here was the one I told myself, that I could disappear from the past and not be followed. The room went quiet. Later that night, Ruth took Lily to the garden. Fireflies danced around them, and the scent of wisteria filled the air. Lily wore her birthday dress early, twirling between the hedges, her laughter echoing in the twilight. "Mama Ruth," she whispered, tugging at Ruth's sleeve, "do you think people stay bad forever?" Ruth knelt, brushing a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. "No, baby. I think some people are just afraid. And fear makes them cruel." Lily nodded solemnly. He had a scratch on his face. The man in the bushes. He looked like he was crying but mad at the same time. Ruth's breath hitched. "You saw him again?" Lily nodded. "He was there yesterday, behind the roses. I didn't tell anyone." Ruth squeezed her hand. "Next time you tell me, always." The next day, the test arrived by courier. Charles and Lily sat at the kitchen table. Ruth administered the swabs, her hands steady though her insides twisted. When it was done, Charles held the envelope in his hand, staring at it as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. "We send it tonight," he said. "I want this finished." But by dusk, the courier never returned. Walter checked the security system, no tampering, no vehicle at the gate. The test kit had vanished from the mail drop before pickup. "I checked it myself," Walter swore. "It was sealed and ready." That night, Charles received a message on his private phone. No number, no voice, just a video clip. A man in a dark hoodie stood in front of a small bonfire, holding the sealed test kit. Behind him, the Blue Haven estate flickered faintly in the background. The man held the kit up, then dropped it into the flames. Charles stared, jaw clenched. Ruth stood beside him, silent. A second message followed. "You want truth? You'll have to find it the hard way. I'm already closer than you think." Suddenly, every shadow in the house felt alive. Walter moved to increase security, adding motion lights, alert sensors, arming the old fence alarms long buried beneath flower beds. But inside, Ruth couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. Mason wasn't just threatening exposure. He was enjoying the unraveling. This wasn't about paternity. It never had been. It was about control. About making her doubt herself again. That night, in the attic, Ruth found the last piece of the past she had kept buried. A letter from Mason, dated the week before she left him. "I know what you're planning. If you leave with her, I swear I'll find you. I'll watch, I'll wait. I'll remind her what you did." She had read it 100 times. She read it again now. Downstairs, Charles poured a double bourbon and paced the library. Why would someone destroy a test unless they already knew the result? He muttered. Walter sat nearby, staring at the fireplace. Or unless the result wasn't what they wanted it to be. At midnight, Ruth walked into the room and laid 2 things on the table: the letter from Mason and the original test result. Charles read both, then looked up. "She's not his," Ruth said. "Not in blood, but he still thinks she is." Charles didn't speak. He just nodded and looked toward the darkened window. And in the woods, watching from the crest of the hill, Mason lit a cigarette and whispered, "Let them believe the storm has passed. They're still coming tomorrow, Ruth. Balloons, cake, all of it, no matter what." Charles's voice rang with a certainty Ruth hadn't heard since before Maria's illness. He stood at the edge of the garden, sleeves rolled to his elbows, directing staff who were erecting a white canopy near the rose trellis. It was the morning of Lily's birthday. The house buzzed with rehearsed joy, but beneath every smile lay tension pulled taut like piano wire. Ruth stood beside him, arms folded. The early light shimmered off the dew-laced petals, but her gaze drifted constantly to the hedges. "They'll all be here," she said quietly, "and so will he." Charles glanced sideways. "You think he's that bold?" Ruth nodded. "He always was." Walter stepped onto the lawn with a clipboard, reciting the guest list. 12 kids, 10 parents, 2 teachers from Lily's school, and Eleanor, who invited herself, of course. Security's been told to watch the perimeters, but no uniformed officers. You wanted subtle. Charles gave a dry smile. Subtle might be a luxury we can't afford. By midday, the estate transformed. Pink ribbons wound around the white chairs. A tower of pastel cupcakes rose like a monument to innocence. Lily wore a yellow dress and silver sandals, and as she danced among her friends, for a fleeting moment everything felt whole again. Until the gift table. Among the wrapped boxes and tissue paper sat a small envelope. No name, just a silver ribbon. Lily handed it to Ruth, who opened it slowly. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. A single line, typed. Today, she'll meet her real father. Ruth didn't show the note to Charles. She crumpled it in her palm and quietly scanned the crowd. Nothing. No Mason. No figure out of place. But as the piñata cracked open and candy spilled across the lawn, Ruth's heart slammed against her ribs. A man in sunglasses and a baseball cap stood near the back fence, too far to be in focus. But still, she moved fast. Through the kitchen. Out the side gate. Walter spotted her and followed. By the time she reached the fence, the man was gone. Only a footprint remained, pressed into the wet soil. Walter knelt beside it. "Recent. He wanted you to see him." Back inside, Eleanor cornered Charles near the drink table. "I suppose this charade is your attempt at normalcy," she said, "but you're ignoring the bigger issue." Charles turned slowly. "You mean the man terrorizing my child?" "I mean the woman you've let back in who brings danger with every step," Eleanor snapped. "You think this will end with cupcakes and laughter? You're gambling with the family name." Charles set down his glass. "Lily is my family, and Ruth's protected her more than anyone else in this house ever has," Eleanor sneered. "You think Maria would have let this happen?" Charles's voice dropped. "Maria trusted Ruth more than she ever trusted you." Ruth returned just in time to hear that. She met Charles's eyes, a silent thank you between them. As guests began to leave, Lily tugged at Ruth's dress. "There's someone upstairs," she whispered. "In your room." Ruth didn't ask how she knew. Lily had a way of sensing things others missed. She handed her off to Walter and ascended the staircase alone. Her room was dim, the curtains drawn. The moment she stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind her. "Mason?" she said, not turning. "You always knew I'd come," his voice said, quieter now. Older. Worn at the edges. She faced him. He looked thinner, darker under the eyes, but still the same man who once made her believe escape was impossible. "You didn't have to scare her," Ruth said. "I didn't touch her," he replied, "but I needed you to know I still could." She stepped closer. "Why now?" He took something from his jacket, a copy of the DNA test result. Because you lied. Her breath caught. You forged this? No, he said, eyes glittering. I stole the original from the courier, and I ran my own test. Ruth shook her head. That's impossible. I paid someone. I always had her hair, from that stupid stuffed bunny. She lunged for the paper, but he pulled back. I know she's not mine now, he said, but that doesn't change the fact that you stole from me. A life, a daughter. You never deserved her, Ruth hissed. You barely deserved me. He stepped back. You're going to give me something. One of two options. Money or acknowledgement. What? You'll stand with me. Let her meet me, or I swear I will ruin every inch of this house. That precious little garden party will look like a funeral. Ruth stared, stunned, and then without another word, he dropped the paper on the floor and vanished through the side door just as quietly as he'd come. Downstairs, laughter rose again. Lily was opening her last gift. Ruth picked up the DNA report. It was genuine. There, in clinical clarity, paternity excluded. But at the bottom, another note. This copy processed under chain of custody request. Mason Dillard. She folded the paper, slipped it into her coat, and returned to the party. Lily waved at her, cheeks flushed with joy. Charles met her gaze from across the lawn. And in the corner of the yard, near the trellis where roses bloomed too early, a cell phone camera blinked red, recording every move. Some endings don't need fireworks. They need gardens. Quiet ones. With wind whispering through the trees, laughter trailing down brick paths, and voices soft enough to carry both forgiveness and memory. That's how the Whitaker estate sounded months after the chaos, after the threats, the tests, the man who came back not for love, but to unmake what had been healed. The story didn't end with a courtroom or a breaking news report. It ended with Ruth standing beside Charles in that same garden, holding Lily's hand, while guests gathered not for a birthday this time, but for a dedication. The still blooming foundation, named by Lily herself, was launched beneath the same trellis where Mason once watched with malice. Now it bore her drawings etched into plaques, her words about love and forever mommies engraved in soft script. In the end, Charles didn't destroy Mason. He didn't have to. Ruth did something harder. She chose not to let him shape her anymore. She filed a restraining order and handed the evidence to the right people. But more importantly, she looked Mason in the eye one last time during mediation and told him he could never undo what she had built, not with fear, not with shame, and not with threats dressed up as truth. And Eleanor? She showed up late to the dedication, dressed in muted gray, not her usual diamonds. She didn't speak. She simply placed an old photograph of Maria and Ruth on the tribute table and walked away. It wasn't apology, but it wasn't sabotage either. And for a woman like Eleanor, silence was as close as she might ever come to saying, "I see you now." Walter remained. Not just as a guard, but as a quiet guardian of what they'd rebuilt. He started mentoring young men through the foundation. "We protect what we grow," he'd say, echoing Ruth's words from that stormy night when Blue Haven nearly burned in more ways than one. Lily thrived. Her drawings turned into journals. Her nightmares faded. And she began calling Ruth Mom more often than not. No correction, no hesitation. It rolled off her tongue with the ease of love, not habit. As for Charles, the man who once tried to live behind glass walls and inherited wealth, he changed too. He stepped down from 2 boards, spent mornings walking Lily to school, and spent evenings planting things. Tomatoes, hydrangeas, a stubborn lemon tree that never bore fruit, but which he insisted on nurturing anyway. Some things bloom late, he said once, watering its roots. Doesn't mean they aren't trying. Ruth wrote letters, not to Mason, not to her past, but to herself. One for every year she had swallowed silence. She stored them in a wooden box on the mantel. When Lily turned 12, she would hand them over not as secrets, but as stories. Proof that healing was not forgetting. It was remembering with new eyes. The estate changed, too. What once felt cold and curated now pulsed with warmth. The old dining room became a community gathering space. The nursery transformed into a reading room for children from the local shelter. And in the back corner, near the roses, a stone bench was placed. No plaque, no dedication, just a quiet place to sit and remember what they had come through. Some neighbors still whispered about the scandal, the man sat at the party, the DNA test. But Ruth no longer heard them. Her days were filled with soil, with storytelling, with mentoring women who had once believed they were too broken to be loved again. She taught them otherwise. The legacy of the Whitaker name shifted not by press release, but by intention, by choices made in quiet, by a family that learned redemption isn't loud. It's steady. It's the sound of a child sleeping through the night. The feeling of no longer needing to flinch at shadows. The sight of truth, not as a weapon, but as a light. And Ruth, the woman once hired to keep a house tidy, now kept a legacy alive. Not Maria's legacy, not Charles's, but a new one. One born from fire and choice. She didn't replace anyone. She rewrote the story, one tender act at a time. There's a photo on the fireplace now. Ruth, Charles, Lily. And behind it, a note in Maria's handwriting. Long ago recovered from a hidden drawer Ruth once dared not open. It read, "If something happens to me, let Lily have roots, not just wings, and let Ruth raise her." She's always known how to hold broken things without cutting herself. The story was never about proving who belonged. It was about choosing who to hold close, and holding on even when everything begged you to let go. Family is not a bloodline. It's not who names you. It's who fights for your peace when your world splinters. Who stays when it would be easier to walk away. Who tells you that even when the truth hurts, it doesn't make you unworthy of being loved. That is the legacy Ruth leaves behind. That is the truth that stayed. And that is the philosophy that remains. Not all things are inherited. Some are earned. With courage, with grace, with the refusal to vanish. If this story moved you, leave us a number 1 in the comments. And subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of truth, family, and the quiet triumph of love over legacy.